anyone have a question to start?
I'm an Irishman, but I don't actually work in Ireland. I work in the UK. I work for a CMO, and we're an Indian headquartered, but based in the UK, CMO. And it's really fascinating. This afternoon with John and Ina touched a lot of points about new business opportunities. I guess I'm interested to see what's going to land in Ireland in terms of new business opportunities, particularly the next tier down of not big pharma, and big pharma is great, and Ireland seems to be well versed in terms of supporting that, but the next tier down of medicines and where they're being generated from. And they're coming from, I guess, my view is many of them are coming from the next tier down of companies that are being evolved out of big pharma, like the companies you described. But these companies need support in many different ways. They don't necessarily have their own development or manufacturing capabilities, and they probably don't want those either, because that may not be part of their game plan. And you'll see this as well, John, from Quintile's perspective. You'll see that, like ourselves, you're going to be part of a virtual network in many, many cases. And I guess the question is what you see and how you see Ireland being able to benefit from that. Because Ireland is very, very good in particular areas, but does it have the broad capabilities to fill in all the blanks and give a total service offering?
Thank you. Well, that's a very good question. I mean, as somebody said earlier on, as you know, we can't be great at everything. And I think it equally applies to companies. And I think that companies that came out of, the giant companies that came out of, particularly out of America during after the Second World War, including pharma, there was this focus that we do everything ourselves, whether we can do it well or not. And I think Liam said it very well. You know, one of the most important things for all companies is don't be proud. Be prepared to go where the best is. And that means that for some companies, you know, manufacturing is the area of expertise, their area of excellence. For others, it's marketing. For others, it's clinical research, and so on. But you don't have to do all of those yourself. And you're quite right. I mean, there's a lot of companies which are coming in who are virtual companies, who, quite frankly, they don't necessarily do any of these aspects. They'll outsource their marketing, they'll outsource their clinical research, they'll outsource their sales, they'll outsource the manufacturing. So I think that what we're seeing is the evolution of a new model. And it's not going to be the same model for everybody. So for some companies, it'll be one model. For others, it'll be another model. Does that answer your question? Okay, thanks.
Does anyone else want to pick up on that, Pat? So can I ask Pat? I'm interested in the fact that the Irish Medicines Board then has got this unique look horizontally across Europe and European competences. So one of the products we're involved with in gene therapy, recently it was the EMEA that approved the first ever gene therapy in the world. Well, I think China had one beforehand. Took a while, but they got there. I mean, are there any other things we can do to help drive more regulatory innovation?
Well, first of all, I think reflecting a comment you made yourself about picking up business cards today and knowing people and so on, I was very taken by that, because I think we find in the regulatory world generally that especially young companies are very slow coming to talk to the regulator. And that's a very important perspective that we bring in Ireland, that we really do want people. I mentioned it in my slide about manufacturing sites, but the same applies wherever your niche is. You are in a regulated industry. Therefore, it's extraordinary sometimes the people who are working in various segments of this industry who have absolutely zero knowledge. They don't even know the regulator exists. You know, they're not. It's actually as bad as that in some cases. So that's our fault, I guess, too, in terms of communicating with and so on and so on. I think there's this international summit of regulators, which I think was a very important initiative. The FDA were celebrating their centenary, and they invited this group that I mentioned, this group of friends of the FDA, if you like. There were people that the FDA had bilateral arrangements with. So that's why we were there, because we had signed a bilateral arrangement with FDA, which allows us to access information in a confidential way and share information with them, which works very, very well. But we took the initiative to make that an annual summit, and we invited this whole gang back to Ireland the following year. And that has that has worked into a summit that has now met 5 times, and we're meeting at the end of November for the next meeting, and we are now beginning to talk about a much bigger coalition of regulators worldwide. And at the end of the day, you see it, we see it, you see it in various ways. I think the inspection tourism that some people, if they're in the manufacturing side, will know, where you have new agencies developing around the world, and suddenly they need to inspect every damn plant around the world. They need to come to Ireland, even though we've already inspected them last year or whatever and whatever. And the same applies in assessment work. It applies in assessing clinical trials and all of that. So there's a fairly substantial engagement going on between Europe, that's by the European Commission and its agency, which is the EMA, and with the US FDA, where they have very regular teleconferences to talk about early scientific advice for products, clinical trial applications for products, and assessments for products. And then also what I mentioned about joint inspections or sharing inspections and so on. I would say that what you need to do is engage with the regulator and talk to the regulator and challenge the regulator. And I say that to my colleagues, my staff and colleagues in other agencies, that there's an imbalance of power in the relationship. The industry has all the knowledge and the information about what's coming and the new products and how they're developed and how they will work and so on and so on and so on. We have a specific job to do, but it's by working together and early dialogue that we're going to make progress. So we really would want to encourage that.
Anybody else? Next question. Okay. If you were, Ian, in terms of the other academic groups this morning, this conference is being held with a bit of a sword of Damocles, because you're in the middle of a funding cycle with Science Foundation Ireland, and it's a great time because it means you're all marketing like hell about your different competencies, but it also means that in the cold light of day there'll be successful people and non-successful people. But a huge work and creativity has gone in to getting the companies, both big and small, to commit both internally and right the way through their management groups. I mean, if you were king for a day, or president for a day, what would you do to try and make sure that the unsuccessful projects don't lose that capital that has been put in?
I think that's a fairly straightforward thing. Can I borrow you? Yes. So I think that's a fairly straightforward question. I mean, I would strongly encourage people not to give up, because just because you don't get funding through one of these particular calls. I'm a professor of bioprocess engineering, and I've had some ups and downs in getting my own funding activities together. But you don't give up, you just look for new partners. So the calls we've heard about today, a lot of these calls are related to industry. So I personally would suggest you go more to the industry. You don't have to rely on the funding bodies to get your funding to do your work. Go to the companies, discuss with the companies, get their support in order to do the early stage work, such that you can go back and you can reapply. For example, the research center calls came out this year, but there will be another call next year. So if you're unsuccessful this year, link with the companies, bring them together. And again, a bit of a plug for NIBRT is that NIBRT is a coordination center between industry and academia and research centers. So if you need help and support from companies, I mean, give you an example, one of the research center calls was short, let's say, on some of the industrial funding. So they came to me, and within about 10 minutes with 3 phone calls, we could raise that funding through our different partners with industry to help them support that application. So in other words, you don't give up. You have to, I mean, I say it like this, in the Irish environment, it's very competitive. The funding is fairly limited. It's becoming quite, let's say, concentrated in a few areas. Therefore, it's extremely competitive. So you have to network, you have to get together with the organizations like NIBRT, but with also the funding agencies, and you have to bring them together to solve problems. Don't give up. That's my approach. And even if necessary, what I sometimes do is go out from Ireland. I mean, it's even the case where if I cannot get a particular program through, since we're becoming internationally famous now, renowned for expertise in a certain number of areas, one way to kick off some of these, and I've done it, is to actually go abroad, bring in some seed capital from an external source, and then use the encapsulation I showed you. Actually started with Swiss funding, And now it's got to a certain point that we are actually bringing it here, and we're going to develop a startup here to specifically become a center of excellence in that technology. So just don't give up.
Clyde, if you can introduce. Do you want to? If you want to, I think somebody else had their hand up. Do you have your hand? Sorry, Frank, please. It's coming. Just is there a microphone? For?
Yep.
Okay, thank you. Ambrose McLaughlin had to leave on urgent business and sends his apologies to everyone here that he couldn't stay.
Frank Hallinan. When the Celtic Tiger was a mere cub, one of the actions that was taken by the then government was the introduction of the idea of a chief government scientific advisor. And after a short hiatus, I guess that took off and seemed to go very, very well. And we had a chief scientific advisor for a number of years. We're here today now talking about optimising Ireland, not about doing things, but about doing things in the optimum way. Is the absence of a chief scientific advisor going forward going to help our prevent, if you like, or minimise the opportunity to optimise Ireland in this particular domain?
Would anybody like to start?
Well, coming from outside, that's a little bit more difficult for me to answer, but frankly, I don't think so. My personal view is that the art, and I think again the agencies are coming together. When I arrived here, you have the IDA, Enterprise Ireland, all these different organisations as independent entities, and it seems to me now that this bringing them together and having them talking to each other and relating to a government policy, you don't need, I think, a particular person to lead that. I think it's more bringing the people together and having a clear strategy to go forward. So my personal view is I don't think that that's inhibiting it at all.
Anybody else?
I mean, I would by and large agree with that. I think that, again, to the point, which is great to see, is that I think there's a much greater collaboration and cooperation between, you know, the IDA, Scientific Foundation Ireland, and Enterprise Ireland. I think that's great to see. I mean, oftentimes in our company, for example, we will see, you know, a representative of all three at a meeting, and I think that's great. Whereas in the past, we wouldn't have seen that. We would have seen one day, the other the week after, and so on. So I mean, the thing which I would really again appeal for is a greater degree of collaboration, a greater degree of talking. I think that another thing which would drive this industry really, really well, or drive the development of clinical research, is people focusing on the areas that they're really good at. You know, the thing is, you know, you kind of mentioned it yourself earlier on, focusing on the finance people being great finance people, the scientists being great scientists, the marketeers being great marketeers, and really have, you know, I know the old phrase they used to say, you know, the first thing on the agenda when a committee meets in Ireland is the split. Well, you know, I'd like to see the first thing on the agenda is joined up thinking, with bringing specialists together to make a success, because, you know, no one individual can do all of that. It needs a team, and a team of excellent people to drive these things.
I'm going to abuse the platform and make two comments. One, I think we were extraordinarily well served by Paddy Cunningham, the outgoing chief scientist, and he set a very high bar. I think no less than in this building during the summer, where there was a fantastic innovation conference that created a real can-do atmosphere in terms of innovation. And I think that is anybody who got to come to any of that, and then the spin-off events around side sessions with the PDA and all of that, it created a great focus, and it meant science and innovation was front and centre of the newspapers, with not just their science correspondent but their business correspondents and various people here. And I'm just going to, you know, I think we have to be careful on policy, but my concern is really that policy goes underground, and that by having a very small group of people who are talking with each other all the time in different fora, the rest of us who are involved in the sector don't hear about what those decisions are being made. So I think that it's not about the people, it's also around some of the, how do we get to hear what the next shifts will be if we don't have a public dialogue around it. So I think events like this are very helpful to challenge the combined role, to come up with a clear plan for that part, the advocacy for science, the decision making and be transparent on that side. But that's my view. Is there anybody else who'd like to?
I just have one quick question.
Can you introduce yourself?
Natalie Boole from Janssen. Just a quick one in terms of patient involvement at HTA level, which I think John touched upon and Ambrose as well. Does the panel have any views on what kind of structures that should take? So I think obviously Janssen would welcome more patient involvement at very early stages, but I think at the moment that's not, the structures are just very unclear in terms of at a HTA level and so on. So I just would welcome the panel's views.
Well, I think that one of the things we obviously need to be very careful about is any engagement with patients. It needs to be appropriate. It needs to be, quite frankly, probably to some degree regulated. And I think that you're talking about HTAs in real world. I think we're going to see a lot more of that. Quite frankly, I think that they're going to be very similar to the phase 4 observational type studies. It's just that we now collect more data, and we collect data around the economic aspect. So I think that the level of engagement will be around good clinical practice. A number of people have spoken today about convergence. Well, there's been convergence where the commercial world to some degree has stepped into the clinic, what was historically the clinical world, and the clinical world has stepped up into the commercial world. I think that's appropriate. I think what used to happen is that research and development came along, developed a fantastic drug, came to the big wall and flung it over the wall, and the commercial guys were on the other side waiting to catch it. And sometimes that wasn't a good idea. You needed to have commercial back several years actually looking at what the opportunity was and saying, does this make commercial sense? But you also need to have the clinical guys up with the commercial guys saying, this is the way and this is the most appropriate way that this should be done. And that means operating in the commercial world at good clinical practice and at a high regulated standard. We should have high regulated. This is a highly regulated industry, most highly regulated industry in the world. It should be, because each day we deal with patients' lives. And I think that the same applies in relation to real world studies and HTAs.
Just a quick comment. One of the big issues from my side at present is as soon as the regulatory work is all finished, it's still the case that some drugs, some products are still then having to begin their HTA work. And what we're trying to advocate for at various fora, internationally in particular, is what we call early engagement between the regulatory side and the HTA side, so that in your development program, you're taking account of the requirements of both, so that when you get to the stage of having your regulatory approval, you already have 95% of the data together that you need that satisfies the requirements of the HTA folk. And there's no reason why the trials can't be designed in such a way. There will always be outliers or things you'll have to do somewhat separately, and maybe specific country-specific things and so on. But the general thrust of your development program should be taking account of your HTA requirements at a much earlier stage, and you should be integrating that with your clinical efficacy work, so that your effectiveness, real-world effectiveness, is also captured at that stage. That'd be my view on it. And there's a lot of effort going on. And I think at the Commission level in Europe, in terms of policy, I know the Commission have announced recently Commissioner Daly, or ex-Commissioner Daly, as he is now, the Maltese Commissioner that left office about a week ago, as you know. He announced recently that during next year there will be very substantial support given to driving this whole agenda forward and developing HTA as a more formal network in Europe. Yeah.
Can I just add one point on that about some experience with fighting blindness in Ireland across, they're very important partners in Genable, the company developing autosomally dominant ORP therapies. But they're very active in Brussels. And the Health Research Board in Ireland, through Enda Connolly, has made, first of all, they can fund projects, co-fund them with the HRB. That's not just about using patients' money from shaking your tin. It's also about making those organisations strategically more competent about engaging with other partners. So there is it's not a problem for the pharma people, but sometimes pharma people can't go too close to the patient groups without that being seen as being inappropriate. So that's in a patient group. If there isn't a group already working in that area, I think people like Avril Daly and the Medical Research Charities Group are a very good place to start to put together maybe seed funding to get an advocacy group. As English speakers in the European Union, our charities do extraordinarily well, and Europa Donna and some of those organisations. And then they in turn can drive, particularly with the UK and NICE, some very, very good high quality health technology assessments and link into the US organisations. So, you know, help some of the patient groups to organise sufficiently to be able to be the partners is sometimes a very useful part. Sorry, go ahead, Ian.
Could I go from a totally different direction to look at that and say, well, nowadays we're very focused on blockbuster drugs and things like this. So that's very interesting, but of course many of those drugs don't actually treat the whole population of people who have a particular complaint. So, I mean, if I just take one example, if you are a diabetic, you're classed as type 1 or type 2, and you will get the relative treatment. But actually within those type 1 and type 2, there are probably myriads of different versions, but the treatment is essentially the same. Is that reasonably correct? So what I would suggest is by producing, so if I go back to the bioprocessing, if I can make drugs much more cheaply, much more effectively, on a very reduced scale, so I can say one of the targets of NIBRD is to say, if I take a platform which is not much bigger than this table, and I can produce a drug in such a facility, which is that table, so that means from the raw materials to the finished product, such that I can do that process development, it's so cheap that I could actually then produce those in parallel. So I can have multiple drug delivery systems because they're so much cheaper, instead of investing hundreds of millions to develop a drug. And by doing that, I can now look at those drugs, so those, for example, insulin again or something like this, or diabetes, and I can actually produce many variants of it, because even if many of them fail, I can still make several of those succeed. Do you understand? So I've got more chance of getting a new product onto the market to treat a more limited group of people. So this personalized medicine, again, comes to the forefront. I think we're too focused on blockbusters sometimes, and by getting very good at the production processes, making them very intensive, making them very cheap to produce in a very system, and then I can actually pick up this platform and I can actually move it to wherever I want to produce it, which is another aspect. So my personal view is it's the cost of drug manufacturing which limits us to these sort of blockbusters. And this, we ought to take into account the patients, therefore, because they're saying some of these drugs are not suitable for them. Therefore, we ought to be designing and producing multiple variants of drugs.
There's a gentleman there, and then Anne McGee. Yeah.
Hi, it's Liam Cullen from GSK. Just a question primarily directed at Pat. We're in your European hat. Obviously, in the first 6 months of next year, we'll host the presidency of the European Union. And does that, you know, present really good opportunities to put the focus on the pharma industry in Ireland, and also on the regulatory affairs side? What do you see the priorities as being for the first 6 months, and you know, if you picked up anything on the health side also?
Well, the first 6 months of next year, I've said to my staff, all leave is cancelled. That gives you a hint of what it's like for us. It's going to be a tough period. But I think for Ireland Inc., just for the whole economy, right across every sector, the presidency is an opportunity to showcase Ireland in everything we do, and to get away from this damn begrudgery that's out there at the moment on the media and so on. I'd love to see the first 6 months actually giving us an opportunity for a step change in where we are in the economy. That's my personal ambition for it. On the regulatory side, there's an extraordinarily busy schedule of new legislation in Europe. I mentioned clinical trials, medical devices. There's a whole new range of 2 new regulations completely revising the medical devices legislation, all to be read during council, during our presidency. There's work going on controlled drugs, preclinical precursor chemicals. There's stuff going on cosmetics. There's a new veterinary medicines directive, a regulation being proposed. So it's going to be extraordinarily busy. We will have in Ireland at the regulatory end, we'll have about 20 meetings during our presidency where all of the leading regulators in whatever area they are, CHMP or whatever different committees that you hear about at Europe, will all have 1 or 2 meetings in Ireland during that period. So there's certainly a great opportunity to showcase Ireland and to showcase what we do and the different parts of the industries that are here and so on. And we'll be doing that to the best of our ability. But it's a much bigger thing than just IMB, as you appreciate. It's a whole of Ireland thing. It's combined with the gathering, I think, next year as well. So we'll have all kinds of good things happening next year, hopefully. It's going to be a busy time, but a very exciting time. And we're ready for it. We have all our arrangements made for 20 meetings. We also have a couple of seminars that I've got involved with, one in particular in Trinity in June, which is the European Parliament has just established a committee, which is an interesting, maybe of no interest to this group, but a committee on focusing on risk and taking a risk approach to legislation. Can you imagine that? A group of politicians, when what we see regularly with legislation going through Europe is it gets talked to death during the council technical discussions, and then you have a piece of legislation that you think is there, industry associations, everyone knows what it's about, and then suddenly at the last minute it's in the Parliament and you get a couple of amendments. Braille on packaging for medicines is a classic example. There was no analysis done of the cost benefit of that or anything else. It was introduced at the very last minute in the discussions in the Parliament in the last revision of the medicines legislation. Suddenly, every single medicine had to have Braille on the outer packaging. So I'm trying with my colleagues in Europe to talk about that. And there's a very good guy called Ragnar Loestat, who's a Swedish guy working in King's College in London, who's heavily involved and invested in the whole area of risk communication and transparency in all those areas. So I'm involved with him and a group to have a conference in Trinity, which will bring these people from the European Parliament in June to Dublin to talk about having a proper risk-based approach. Now, it's the beginning, it's the very small beginning of a dialogue, but I think it's a very important one. So there'll be, I'm sure, across all the sectors in Ireland, there'll be a range of very important things that will happen during that period.
And if we can get a microphone to Anne McGee.
Hi, Anne McGee, McGee Farm International. It's been a great day, I think everyone will admit so far, and I think there's been a lot of really interesting presentations that talk about the potential in Ireland to further develop the industry even from where it is at this point, and a lot of that depends on development. And taking Ian's point further in terms of we can have these wonderful platforms that we can, you know, bring from development into a manufacturing environment. But what we've also got to do is we've got to integrate compliance from development into manufacturing. And I think that we haven't actually heard much today, or people haven't commented much on compliance. I know Pat is here, and it's great to see Pat here. And we all know we must work to compliance, but the integration of risk-based compliance systems from development through into manufacturing, I think, is both an opportunity and a challenge for us still in the industry here in Ireland. I don't know if anybody has any comment on that.
Well, I would have made a kind of reference to that already, and I think it's a very valid point. I talked about some folks not being even aware of the existence of the regulator, and never mind that there were compliance challenges. You know, I think we have to go much further back into the development phase to have an appreciation of those issues. So, I mean, I think your comment is very well made. Thank you.
Okay.
If I could,
yes, please.
from the more scientific side of things, that's exactly the philosophy that we're pushing, at least in NIBRD and the associated groups with it. When you're developing a new process, so the word integration, so we talk of integrated bioprocessing or biopharma, and this simply means that from the outset, when you're developing a new process, you do it with compliance and so on, regulatory in mind. So from the very first molecular biology, if you like, developing cell lines, right through to every step of the process. And to give you an example, in fact, I would say Ireland is very, very strong, at least in an area which is some of the analytical methods which are currently used to determine the quality of a protein. So in other words, if we're making recombinant drugs, I mean, again, I don't want to keep pushing NIBRD, but we have probably the world's leaders in things like glycobiology. And as a result, we have people like the FDA who are coming to us. They send us samples of drugs because we have techniques which are world-leading techniques. So these are techniques which are becoming the industry standard for controlling the the quality of a drug at every stage during its development. And so this is our philosophy. Now, when I said the platform is not just on the producing the drug, but it's producing a drug which has exactly the characteristics that you would like it to have, We are also very strong in Ireland, for example, in PAT. So you mentioned it this morning. So this is a subject we are really very good at. So when you're developing the process, you can monitor and control that process at every single stage for those quality attributes at the end. So you can always, it facilitates dramatically the time from development right through to certification. And
I think the transfer from that then into commercial application is really critical from that compliance point of view.
I agree.
Because that's often where you see gaps.
Yeah. But if you take that into account while you're developing these processes, then of course this smooths everything dramatically.
So we're beeping here, so the trapdoor is opening on me this time. Can I implore you to stay for the next session? There's a change in the programme, and I think it's a great change because we started off with Liam giving us a worked example, a case study about why working with a cluster changes not just the small cultures of Irish research groups, but more importantly, brings a benefit to all people, commercially, scientifically, and skill-wise. So Sigmoid will be joining our group this afternoon of Professor David Braden, Professor Cormac Taylor, and Dr. Sally-Ann Cryan. I think again we'll get a case, if you don't already know it, a real live example of how these technologies come together. And again, it isn't the either or in this funding environment, it's the and if about bringing these things together. So if you can come back here at 3:30, and don't forget 4 business cards, these 4, people you don't know, okay? Thank you.
It's lovely to meet you.